Oh,
We're starting out.
hello, welcome to Dragon Tail Books. I'm Ann Vogel, I'm the owner, so thank you all for coming tonight. This is the second in our environmental series. The first one was January 18th about adapting to climate change, so you can watch that on our YouTube channel if you're interested. So we're going a little more local today. And I kind of created this series because I want to learn more about our local issues and bring it to the community, and I have a passion for figuring out how I'm connected to this environment and what I can do so that I don't wreck it. So today, thank you to Nicole Hayes and Arthur Kneeland from UW-Stout Biology Department. So they're here to talk about the land and lakes of the Red Cedar River watershed. So thank you very much.
All right. Got it. All right, so we're gonna kind of start out with a little bit of history of the lakes in the area, and then get into a little bit about what is causing the challenges in the related to water quality, and then kind of bring it out to the big picture, and then talk about some what can be done and the ways that we should also maybe think about this problem. All right, so the first map that I've ever seen of Lake Menomin calls it the logjam, right? And it always was a lake here before the dam, but historically it was a wild rice bed, and a very prolific one by all accounts. And so when the white settlers arrived in the area, they had the little cha-ching sound go across their eyes, and they began harvesting the logs of the North Woods, which leads to a fantastic inflow of wealth into the Menominee area, with the various lumbering companies, but the Knapp-Stout, I love the name of it, Knapp-Stout and Co. Company, right? Becoming the dominant force. And so the first dam was put into Lake Menomin for logging purposes. So they're running the logs down the river and collecting them for the mills there, and also having logs proceeding downstream as well. And so there's logs moving down the river as well as being turned into boards here. It sort of is the way I've heard this described is that the wood that came through this area built the cities south of us. So St. Louis and Louisiana they were already large cities, but this is sort of between the 1850s, 1860s through to the 1900s when all this activity is really going. So this is, you can see the log jam back here and the dam activity. And this really would have been the first thing that wiped out the native ecosystems in the waterway here. I think about these logs kind of like a gigantic scouring pad going down the river, right? And just eradicating all of the native systems that were present. So that, as well as drowning them, right? And so here we have the sort of, it's not that clear, but here's what the log jam looks like. And still today we see the references to this out in the middle here of the lake. You'll notice there's, I haven't looked today, are the trees still up? Does anybody know? We still have ice in the center. That's a spring there, and that would have been the wellspring of the lake. And so, but even in this map, we can see that there's more complexity in the waterway, even in the very first damming, there's islands and things going on in the waterway. This is the cemetery, not an island yet. And then here we have a picture, I believe. So this is, you see the one lane of the bridge that goes over, and there's a second bridge here. And so this would have been 30s probably sometime. There was an aerial survey that was done in I want to say 1936, and so we have a lot of really great record from that era. And so that was the first modern dam was in place at this point. And we can see the deltas that are here, right? So there's water coming in, but there's plant life, right? And so we have a very complicated lake system in place here. And I think that really is part of an important part of the story of the lake, because it's a very alive thing. There's a number of reasons why this has always been such a vibrant system from the era of wild rice forward till now. And so at these points in the lake's history, you hear people talk about, oh, you used to be able to swim in it, and all these sort of stories about the delight that people had around the lake. We had a floating boathouse that people, they would drag out into the lake in the summertime, and it was a real centerpiece of the town, and they'd throw parties out there, and there were all of these trails down along the edge here. And I had a sustainability student who did a research project on it, and the stories he unearthed about the joy that people took in the lake was really tremendous. And so to just kind of, this is something that's really important to me personally, because I've spent my entire adult life harvesting wild rice with my parents up in northern Minnesota. And northern Minnesota is a drastically different ecosystem than here. It's bedrock, right? It doesn't go very deep, right? You go down and you hit the Canadian Shield very quickly. And so it's a much more nutrient depleted system than what we have here, because here we're on ancient ocean bottom, which is very rich. I've harvested in Wisconsin, and it's kind of a nightmare, because the rice, this picture is in Minnesota. This rice was about this tall. And so you're sitting in the boat, knocking the rice into the boat. And it's one of the most beautiful ecosystems I've ever seen. But in Wisconsin, you'll hit rice that's 8 feet tall or taller. And that's actually why people in Minnesota and Wisconsin harvest in opposite directions. In Minnesota, we push the boat from the front going backwards. And in Wisconsin, they push from the front of the boat. So the polar is in the front, moving this way, and the picker is in the back of the boat, knocking forward. And so it's just because of the drastically different nutrients in the different systems that leads to this shift in kind of how people approach harvesting the wild rice. And this is the plant that the lake is named after, right? So Monoman means good berry in Anishinaabe, this is one of my sort of, you have those goals that you're like, I don't know how we're going to get there, but that's one of the goals. I would love to have rice grow in this lake again. That is so far out there that I don't sort of know what the next step is, right? But I think that it's important, right? Because
yeah, so I'm gonna change gears a little bit then. So Arthur gave us that lovely introduction to kind of the history of the lake, and I'm gonna talk a little bit more about the lake now, and maybe what the lake and how the lake has changed over the last few decades. And so these two pictures up top are Lake Monoman, right? And this is often what people think about when they're thinking about Lake Monoman. Green, sludgy, smells bad in the middle of summer. And so I'm gonna kind of give a talk in two parts with two different, slightly different sets of data. First question is going to just be about how water quality is changing over time the last few decades. And then I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about some of the work I've been doing at Stout, looking at maybe what's happening on an annual basis in terms of water quality. And then we'll go back to Arthur, spend a little more time thinking hopeful thoughts about how we might make a difference in the future. And then at the very end, highlight some of the actually really positive qualities that Lake Menomin still has. So bear with me. I'm going to do the kind of disappointing part right now first. Okay, so I said I'm going to talk about water quality, but water quality is a really subjective term. What water quality means for one person, it is a very different thing for another. So if you are, say, a boater and you're water skiing, you might want a lot different characteristics of your water than someone who is fishing. I was walking yesterday morning and I talked to some ice anglers about Lake Menomin and how they were doing, and they were like, don't change anything about this lake. I can go out and catch my quota of crappie every day if I want to, right? So water quality means different things to different people. I am an ecosystem ecologist, and so I'm going to really focus on some of the properties of the lake that have to do with how much primary production is happening. So primary production can be both an indicator of nutrient pollution, but it's also an indicator of food for fish. So it goes a little bit both ways. So my indicators of water quality that are relevant to primary production are first water quality or water clarity. So I'm going to talk about how much visibility there is in the water. How much visibility in the water depends on a bunch of different factors. Largely, it's determined by the amount of erosion, so how much sediment is coming off the landscape, and it's also determined by how much primary productivity there is, so how much algae or phytoplankton are growing in the water. So it's a really good composite metric, but it's not very specific. The other thing I'm going to talk about then is are those phytoplankton, specifically looking at how much phytoplankton is in the lake. And so phytoplankton is really simply the amount of small photosynthetic organisms that float in the water column. So they're the things that are making the that lake look green. So I call it phytoplankton. Other people also call it algae. So can kind of use the terms interchangeably, but I'll say phytoplankton because it's more precise if you're a pendant developmentology like me. All right, and then finally, the last thing I'm going to talk about is some research I've been doing with undergraduates at UW-Stout, looking specifically at one of the different toxins that's produced by cyanobacteria. So we know that not all phytoplankton are great food for fish, and one of the reasons they're not great food for fish or great for people is that they produce toxins that can be harmful to people, pets, or livestock that interact with the water. And so I'm going to show some data that I have looking at changes in the concentration of those toxins over time. One other thing I want to mention is that, so I've been at Stout for 4 years, but I'm going to show you a few decades worth of data. So Wisconsin has a really rich history of sampling water quality, and that's everyone from agencies. The DNR has a really long history of collecting water quality data, but also local groups, municipalities, and citizens. So most of the data pre-2002 that I'm going to show you, I pulled from the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources Surface Water Integrated Management System. So if any of you have ever volunteered to collect water data on Tainter or on Menomin, I likely pulled some of your data from this database. And so it is amazing. I am showing you just a small sliver of the information that's available on these two lakes, and the vast majority of that comes from citizen involvement. So this is an incredibly data-rich place to have been fortunate enough to get a job. I'm also going to show you some data that I collected along with another professor at Stout. We're funded by the Freshwater Collaborative of Wisconsin, and then also data from the Lakes RU, for which Arthur is also one of the leads for that. So I have a whole bunch of different data sources. And I'm going to be showing you data from 2 different points on Tainter Lake and Menomin Lake. On Menomin down here, I collected water from the deep spot just between that well that Arthur mentioned and the outflow of the lake. And at Tainter, we're kind of near the southern basin we are at the southern end of the southern basin, kind of where Tainter is really wide up top. Okay, so how is water changing in these lakes? Like I said, the first thing I'm going to show you is this composite variable that looks at or this variable that kind of looks at a composite of different water clarity factors. Has anyone here ever seen a Secchi disc before? It's a white and black disc. It looks just like this. It's basically a dinner plate that's cut into quadrants and it's black and white. It's really simple. You can just lower it on a rope through the water and you measure how deep it is before it disappears. If it's further away from you, that means water is clearer. If it's shallower, that means water has a lot more stuff in it. It's more turbid. And so you can have a whole range of Secchi depths. One of the deepest, clearest lakes in the United States is Lake Tahoe, where Secchi depth can be greater than 60 feet. And then you can contrast this with, say, Lake Tainter, when I sampled with some undergraduates in 2002. When you set the Secchi disc on top of the lake, it sank through the sludge and then you couldn't see it anymore. So Secchi depth of less than an inch. So we have a range. So the first thing I'm going to show you here are annual average Secchi depths for Lakes Tainter and Monoman from between 1990 and 2022. And so again, remember, deeper depths means clearer water, shallower depths means murkier water, and we're looking at annual averages. The other thing I want you to remember is this is a composite variable, so it just tells us stuff in the water. It could be sediment from erosion, it can be phytoplankton. So it's all inclusive, but it's rough. All right, so each of these points then, like I said, I misspoke, each of these points is a summer average Secchi depth. And so what you can see is that most of the time, the average water clarity based on Secchi depth in these lakes in summer is between 1 and 5 feet, right? Not surprising, we're not approaching the 60 feet of Lake Tahoe, but that does mean that it is not always just a few inches deep. So we do have some range of water clarity in both of these lakes. Note that there is a lot of variability from year to year, right? Some years are clearer, some years are murkier. And we see that, for those of you that spend time out on the lake, we see that out on the lake, right? Some years, Monoman is really stinky and green, and some years it is less so. That's reflected in this data. The other thing to note is that there really isn't a trend over time in water clarity. But for the last 30 years, water clarity has, on average, remained about the same. All right, but like I said, I'm an ecosystem ecologist. Secchi can tell us a little bit about how much primary production is happening, but what I really want to know is how much algae is actually in these lakes. So I also went back to that SWIMS database and I collected data, or I pulled data from the data set, averaged it, and figured out how much total chlorophyll is in this lake. So how much phytoplankton, which we measure by measuring the amount of pigment in the water, how much phytoplankton biomass is in these lakes on average in the summer. And again, each of these is an average of total chlorophyll, so total biomass in the summer. Okay, so just want to give you some guidelines here on what relevant values are. So a really crystal clear lake, a lake that we consider oligotrophic or in a very pristine condition, has chlorophyll of less than 5 micrograms per liter. Based on what Arthur told us, we were a very marshy ecosystem. We would never expect this system to be oligotrophic or to be that low nutrients. And so we would always expect it to be a little bit higher. In 1990, when the DNR and the EPA first started kind of studying this system and seeing if it should be put on the impaired water list for the state, which it was and it still is to this day, they were measuring chlorophyll concentrations on average of 87 micrograms per liter. And the goal of kind of that total maximum daily load, or the goal of all of the reductions in phosphorus pollution coming off the land, was to get chlorophyll concentrations down to closer to 25 micrograms per liter. So just to give you some idea of kind of the range of concentrations we had been seeing and what the goals are. Again, each of these points represents an annual summer average. And so in Tainter, what we see is that most of the time, most years, average chlorophyll is far above that goal concentration of 25 micrograms per liter. Sometimes we get close, but for the most part, we still have a lot of chlorophyll. So we still have a lot of phytoplankton in the lakes. One thing I want to note, and this is not statistically sound, but I do want to say one piece of hope I draw from this data is that in the last, say, 10 years, it does look like the high years are a little bit lower, right? I would have to, we don't have quite the right data to do a good time series analysis on this, but I'm hoping to kind of explore this more in depth after I find someone who wants to do this next with me. All right, so hopefully it seems like the upper limit on Tainter is coming down. Monoman, unfortunately, we don't see that trend with recent years having a lower maximum, but overall Monoman does just have a lower total phytoplankton biomass than Lake Tainter. And so all in all, I don't know how many of you spend time on Tainter and Monoman. I think you can see this just if you're going out on the lake, but Monoman tends to be a little bit less green in summer. You have fewer kind of surface blooms. Doesn't mean it's not gross sometimes, but overall the water quality in terms of phytoplankton biomass is a little bit lower. So what this tells us is, there's still a lot of nutrients in these systems. Again, even if we started turning off the spigot for phosphorus from the watershed in the 1990s when the EPA and the DNR started putting those limits in place, we would not necessarily expect major changes to be happening this quickly. It takes a long time for phosphorus to reach out of the watershed. So not unexpected, maybe hoping it would go down a little bit, but yeah. Okay, and now I want to change gears a little bit, and instead of oh, yeah, sure.
So the points that are, I'm not from around here, the points that are really low, like on the Tainter ones,
Yep, down here.
Yeah, and even those ones, yeah. Was there, were they all taken from around the same time, or were those taken in the winter or something?
So every one of these points is an average of chlorophyll concentrations that were taken in July and August. So I excluded, because you're exactly right, we wouldn't expect as much phytoplankton growth in the winter, although I've had some students collecting phytoplankton in the winter, and in Monoman, we always see about 20 micrograms per liter. So even in the middle of winter, we have a fair amount of phytoplankton that are busy growing, but no, that should be controlled for in this data.
Which is one of the cooler pictures that I've seen in a poster, was this ice column with green lines in the ice. It was pretty neat.
Okay.
There's another one with Dr. Hayes with her hand straight down into the frozen water out on the ice. Keep an eye out for that.
All right, so we have these annual averages, and then I want to kind of pull out these last two data sets, because these are years that data was collected by students at Stout, and so we don't just have kind of a scattering of data from the summer, we have a pretty good time series. And so with this time series from these years, 2022, 2023, I'm going to talk a little bit more specifically about those problematic type of phytoplankton, the cyanobacteria, the ones that can produce some different toxins, and then show a little bit of toxin data as well. All right, so here again, we're looking at chlorophyll concentrations, so total amount of phytoplankton biomass. Only now we're looking at only data from 2023 and only data from the summer period. So day of year 140 is mid-May. Day of year 200 is about early August. And so I'm just going to show you some data that was collected over the course of the summer in these 2 days. The other thing that I want to point out is that we collected data from 2 different depths. So if you've spent any time out on Lake Tainter or Monoman, what you've likely noticed is that the lakes get what are called surface scums, where you get a whole bunch of biomass or a whole bunch of phytoplankton that's just sitting up near the surface of the lake. And that's as a result of the fact, a result of the community composition of the phytoplankton that we have in those lakes. So total phytoplankton biomass is just, I've been measuring as chlorophyll, but we know that there's a lot of different species that live in there. Some of those species are these cyanobacteria, and in particular, we're interested in 2 different species. So this top one is Microcystis, and this bottom one is Aphanisomena. And so if you've ever been out on the lake in the summer, you've looked in the water, and you can kind of see chunks of things in the water. Some of them are kind of pointy and sharp looking. Those are Aphanisomena. And if you see ones that are kind of maybe more fluffy looking, like little clouds, still really tiny, but you can kind of, they're distinct, that's Microcystis. And these 2 species have specialized parts of their cells that are basically like little air balloons. So they can fill up their air balloons and float to the surface of the lake, so they can shade out all the other phytoplankton and they can continue growing, photosynthesizing, going on their merry way with all the light that they want, shade everybody out. So when we get that really thick layer of green at the top of the lake, that's when we know that we have a lot of these. So one of the things the students that were working with me and I did this summer was we collected water from the surface to measure total phytoplankton and water from a little bit deeper. Then you can compare those two and see whether we're getting these surface scums caused by these different species of cyanobacteria. So in this graph, each of those blue dots represents a water sample or chlorophyll concentration in a water sample that I collected at 2 meters depth. And the pink ones represent chlorophyll samples or phytoplankton samples I collected at the surface. And so you can see that in Cedar Lake, most of the summer there was about the same amount of phytoplankton at the surface and at the bottom. But then as we got into July, we started to get a lot more biomass sitting at the surface. So that tells us that that's when those surface scums started to form, and we are ending up with a lot more of these problematic taxa, Microcystis and Phenomenon. See a similar pattern in Kneeland, maybe a little less distinct, where again, early in the year, it's just a pretty well mixed system. Later in the summer, we start to see more indication that we're having surface plumes form. Again, not as bad as tainter, and that was borne out when we just looked at total phytoplankton biomass. So tainter tends to be a little more productive. Tainter tends to have a little bit more of these surface plumes of cyanobacteria. I don't think so. It's weirder, and so like I sample before it, I sample upstream of where it becomes like a river channel and then wider and then a river channel again. So I am more strictly in the lake-like part, but my sampling spot is actually deeper on tainter than it is on Kneeland. So.
Well, and we had the bathymetric map in here, and we decided to take it out.
So could have answered that question.
Also, in my experience, the bathymetric maps are no longer correct because there's so much sediment coming into the lakes. And so the deep point was on the bathymetry is supposed to be like 10 meters, 11 meters, and I've never found deeper than 8.5 meters. So I think it's probably worth resampling some of these lakes. Yeah.
So would a healthy ecosystem where it's all down by 25, right? Would it still have a combination of these bad phytoplankton and the other phytoplankton?
Yeah, so that's something that's really interesting is that all of these species are native and found in every different type of lake, right? Like it is very normal to have these potentially even toxin producing species living in a lake. The problem comes in where they have so much food and they're able to grow so much and create so much biomass. You just have this massive amount of plankton. That's where it becomes a problem, right? When you have less than 1 microgram per liter of microcystin, that's very different than when you have 40 micrograms per liter of microcystin. Yeah, great question. All right, so we do see that we're having some surface blooms. And so then my next question was, all right, surface blooms are unsightly, right? Nobody wants to interact with a lake where you just have a goopy surface. But what's happening in terms of toxicity, right? Like, is it dangerous for people, pets, and livestock to interact with this lake? And so this summer, I had an applied science student, Ethan. He is interested in human health, and he very kindly agreed to come work with me and help me analyze the toxin concentrations in this lake. I focused specifically on one type of toxin called microcystin. So microcystin is a liver toxin. If someone consumes a lot of water, and I mean like a lot of water, it can cause enough liver damage to be fit to cause liver failure and death. But for the most part, even if you drink just a few cups of it, it just can cause some illness, some malaise, some nausea. All right, so liver toxin, liver damage. It is produced by both Microcystis and Aphanizomenon, so I thought it was a pretty good bet that if we were going to find toxins, a toxin, we would find this one. One thing I want to note is that there is a drinking water limit that's established by the World Health Organization that's at 1 microgram per liter. And so that says that finished drinking water, the water coming out of your tap, cannot have more than 1 microgram per liter in it. The EPA sets a recreational water limit of 10 micrograms per liter. So if you are going to be swimming, boating, kayaking, not kayaking, so let's say swimming and boating, if you're going to be actually contacting the water, drinking any of it, they want that microcystin to be less than 10 micrograms per liter. Otherwise, you're at risk of some sort of negative health outcome. And note, my scale doesn't even go up to 10 micrograms per liter. So when we look at kind of the seasonal pattern in microcystin, and again, I sampled kind of deeper in the water column and at the surface in Tainter and Monoman. What you can see in Tainter is that A, we only sampled early in the year, and B, there's no difference between surface and depth. Makes sense, we didn't see any difference in chlorophyll at that point in time. And C, there's just not a lot of toxin there. We were measuring it, we know there's something there, but there is not worrisome quantities of toxin in Tainter, which is interesting because by all accounts up to this point, Tainter had a little worse water quality. And we're going to compare that with Monoman. So again, greater than 1 is greater than the drinking water limit, but it's not until 10 that the World Health Organization and the EPA really start to worry about coming into contact with it when you're swimming. So what you can see here is that as we move later into the summer, we do see microcystin at increasing concentrations very regularly at both the surface and at depth. Again, some indication that that surface scum is producing more of these toxins, so that microcystin is concentrated in the surface layer, which is the layer that people and pets are going to interact with. So there is, some concern about exposure there, but overall concentrations are relatively low, not ideal, but yeah. So we do have this liver toxin present in the surface water of the lake at maybe moderate concentrations, let's say. All right, and then the last little bit of data I'm going to show you is data that was collected by Grace Parrott, who was a Lakes REU student who was here and worked with me this summer. So Ethan collected his data at the deep point. So he went out to that spot right by the outflow of Monoman, collected water from 0 meters, collected water from 2 meters, measured the microcystin. Grace was more interested in how toxicity varied across the entire surface of Lake Monoman. So what she did is she went out, she picked 27 spots on Lake Monoman and grabbed a water sample at 0 meters to measure microcystin. And then, so we took it back to the lab, we measured microcystin, she mapped it up, and then she did some interpolating to create a map that sort of estimates what concentrations would be across the whole surface of the lake. And she did that on 2 days. So this is July 6th. Again, she sampled 27 different points and then kind of averaged across the whole surface of the lake. The color represents the concentration of microcystin. Again, it's never above 5 micrograms per liter. That's this red color. And as it gets lighter and a brighter yellow, the concentrations are lower. I was talking before about the World Health Organization drinking water limit. Grace was more interested in the EPA's drinking water limit, which is 1.6 micrograms per liter, not liter cubed. And so this is her map. We see that across the whole surface of the lake, microcystin concentrations are pretty low. We do have some areas of higher concentration samples that she collected near shore. And I will note that on this day when she was sampling, the wind was blowing in this direction. Mm-hmm. So surface scums were kind of building up along the side of the lake. And so likely she did just grab some surface scums that had been pushed over there. So July 6th, not a lot of microcystin. Fast forward 2 weeks, and she found something very different. So when she went out and did those samples, it was much more likely that where she sampled on the lake was going to have higher microcystin concentration. So the entire lake concentrations were just much higher, and those areas that were where the wind was pushing, again, when she sampled northwest wind. And so this bay over here, I don't know if any of you ice fish, there's often people up here ice fishing, had a lot of phytoplankton biomass over there, probably had a lot of that microcystin and microcystis and aphanizomenon. There was pretty high toxicity. And so she was done working in the beginning of August, so we only had those 2-day samples. I'm really interested in continuing to sample into August and September and continuing in future years, because we know that cyanobacteria blooms on these lakes tend to get worse through August and sometimes even into September. So I would like to find students that want to do this airplane with me. All right, so we know the lake has some problems. In some ways it's maybe better than I would have expected. In some ways it's maybe a little worse than I would have expected in terms of water quality. But, you know, we have a lot of understanding of the reasons for these problems with water quality. And a lot of it has to do with agriculture in the watersheds. I'm sure many of you have seen this map before. This is the Red Cedar River watershed. We have Lake Minoman down here, Lake Tainter up here. All the kind of bright yellow is row crop agriculture. All the gold is pasture, and then the green, as you get up into the northern reaches, are more forested, right? So we have a lot of human activity in the watershed and a lot of human activity that's associated with higher watershed, a lot of human activity that's associated with higher nutrient runoff. But one thing, and Arthur's going to talk more specifically about this in a minute, but I just want to say that from a water quality perspective, when we're thinking about agriculture in the watershed and how we might make improvements to water quality, oftentimes what we're thinking about is just row crop agriculture and tilling practices. So in this picture, we have a model of a watershed. This is our river of interest. And then any drop of precipitation that falls within that dotted line, the water is going to eventually end up in our river of interest, right? That is our watershed. Oftentimes, when we're thinking about the impacts of humans, we're really focused on surface water runoff, right? When it rains, soil is eroding from farm fields into our rivers and streams. You can see that when you see kind of the chocolate milk cover in rivers and lakes, because that sediment, because that's bringing sediment with it, that sediment is bringing a lot of nutrients with it. But one of the things we're learning about studying long-term trends in water quality and changes in agriculture is we also need to think about groundwater and how human activities impact both the amount of groundwater versus surface water and what sort of things are leaching into our groundwater. And so Arthur's going to talk more about conservation tillage and grass runways, but one of the things we do know is that long-term conservation tillage, so when farmers go from tilling their fields multiple times per year, say, to tilling their fields fewer times per year, potentially even not tilling at all in a given year or a few given years, one of the things that we see happen is that we transition from surface water movement to more groundwater movement. That groundwater movement carries different types of nutrients with it, right? Surface water runoff brings a lot of phosphorus, brings a lot of particles of phosphorus. Groundwater runoff brings a lot of nitrogen, brings a lot of dissolved phosphorus. And so also when we think about agricultural practices like tiling really speeds up the nitrogen cycle. So you can basically apply fertilizer, apply nitrogen-rich fertilizer, and if you have any water table, if you have any high water table, you just end up with that nitrate moving right out through the tiles. And so changing how agriculture is done in a watershed can have really significant impacts on water quality. And oftentimes it can be hard to disentangle the effects of it's going to take a while for these management activities to have effect versus we're just going to see changes in surface water runoff versus groundwater runoff, and that can take a while to figure out as well. And so with that, I'm going to step back from the water quality perspective and have Arthur talk about how we're thinking about land use in the watershed.
Yeah, so when we started doing the Lakes RU project, probably more than 10 years ago now, there was a lot of sort of grumbling and finger pointing about the what is causing the water quality. And I like to apply a nice broad equal blame to everybody. Because even though the agriculture does appear to be a pretty large chunk of it, we all eat that food, right? We need that to happen. It's a significant portion of our economic system. And so I'm very hesitant to just point an angry finger at a farmer, right? Because they have a hard enough job without a bunch of people being real grumpy and mean about everything. So That being said, there are some practices that are better than others. One of there's two important pieces of terminology for agricultural waste. It's point source pollution and non-point source pollution, right? It's the stuff that comes out of a defined pipe versus the stuff that is sort of distributed. And so the confined animal feeding operations are a point source of pollution, right? Very large and very heavily regulated institutions. Our watershed tends to be a lot more small farms, and that's a non-point source pollution. Small farms, it's a pretty common thing in the spring in Wisconsin to smell manure being spread onto the fields. It's also not an uncommon thing for manure to be spread onto snowy fields, and that's where we get into trouble, right? That manure goes onto the snow and it mobilizes. And so this form of production where we have the large volume of livestock and the manure being used as a fertilizer can be problematic. It can also actually be better because the nutrients held in the manure are in a complex. They're held up in organic matter and all kinds of things compared to the nitrogen, the anhydrous ammonia that's applied to field, which is very simplified. And so like this problem, I can't tell you how many times I come around to, well, it's complicated, right? And because the farm field is a very complicated thing. One of the things about Wisconsin is we have a lot of ditches, and in the spring those ditches fill up with water, and that water it may be high in nutrients and goes into our waterways. Row crop production in the traditional sense has involved a lot of tilling. Multiple runs with the tractor across the land to till in various ways. When we till land, we are leaving it exposed. And if it rains, that rain hits the bare land and it mobilizes it. It is something that we don't necessarily recognize, but the force that a raindrop applies to the soil is tremendous. And you can maybe even recognize it's in your own garden where you get the dirt on the bottom side of your leaves. That's because those raindrops are hitting that soil and it's going up and out and then going along the gradient. The way that we have been farming for the last 80 to 100 years, industrial agriculture, has done a great job of producing a large volume of food. It has not done a great job of conserving soil. In some places in southern Minnesota, they have worked through about half of the topsoil that the prairie built up over millions of years. We don't get that back. So it's a pretty clear thing to say that something needs to change in the way that we're farming. And that is starting to happen in our watershed in some really neat ways. So that's the farm, the bedrock geology. We are on a 500 million year old ocean bottom. And if you go down to the river and play in the rocks, you will find fossils that look sort of like a little tiny clam. They're not, they're something else, but they are full of nutrients, and specifically phosphorus. And so our groundwater is laced with phosphorus. And then because of the simplified nitrogen that's being applied, we also have a lot of places where the groundwater is also laced with the farm nutrients that were applied. And so there's a lot of wells in our area that have to have cleaning systems put on them because children, for instance, high nitrogen levels can be toxic to children. It's not good for adults either. And so there's, before we started doing any activity in the area, we were already very nutrient rich, right? And then the homes. If we look at Tainter, every single one of those houses has a septic field. And septic fields have a lifespan, 10 to 20 years. And whenever I talk to people about how old their septic field is, it's usually older than that. And septic fields cost thousands of dollars to replace. And so they sit there for a long, long time. And they reach nutrients into the water system. And so it sort of is these three elements that lead to our nutrient-rich system. And assessing exactly how much comes from each one. This one is a pretty manageable assessment. This is going to be pretty difficult. This varies year to year, right, and site to site. So, yeah, that's why I like to blame everyone. Right, we can all share in this problem. Although actually, the city of Menominee probably that water that comes out of our pipe from the wastewater treatment plant is cleaner than the river, right? I've gone on a couple of tours of that place, and you're an environmental nerd when the waste treatment facility is like, wow, that was an exciting tour. But if you ever get an opportunity to go check out the waste treatment plant, it's a blast. They're really cool people, and it's a great tour. So the shifts that are happening in agriculture in our region, I was kind of thinking about who to give credit to this to, and it's impossible. There are so many people who really care about what's going on in this area, from the agency folks, federal, state agency people, to the people directly involved in agriculture, working to make really meaningful shifts in the mode of agriculture. These are grass waterways, and so the point of this is to get plants in the way of that flowing water, right? So plants have these root structures, right, that are above and below the ground, and so the top slows the water down, and then the roots drag the water in, right? And so we block our sediment from flowing, and we get that water to go underground instead of over the surface of the ground. And any time that we can get that water into the ground, good things happen. Right? When it's going across the surface of the land, it's problematic. And so all you have to do is drive around Dunn County and you see these. Right? They're being installed in a wide all over the place. And we have hilly terrain, and so this is a really important activity. It reduces the amount of land that the farmers can sort of put row crops on. But if they have a complex agricultural system, then they can hay this and get another source of money out of it. And I mean, hay over the last couple of years has been at an all-time high because of the droughts occurring that haven't had as much of an effect on us here. And so that the diversification of your income streams is also one of the benefits of some of these agricultural strategies. And then this is conservation tillage. It goes by a bunch of different names: no-till, conservation till, reduced till. The main point here is, instead of flipping that ground over with the plants into it, or harvesting everything at a very low level, we leave the plant matter on the field. And this creates a shield for those raindrops coming in. It also does the same thing that a living plant does, right? The water hits it and it has a channel to go down into the ground. And one of the things that the farmers like the most about it is that it means that they have to drive over their field less, right? So they're spending less time at work, right? They're spending less money on fuel. And there have been several farmers who said that this is the best thing that ever happened because I have this free time to spend with my family. And like, you hear that kind of stuff from a conservation point of view, that like, this is good for our ecology, but when it's also good for the farmer, right, where we can find these rare win-win scenarios, that's tremendous. No-till isn't perfect. No-till has some real problems. If you do it consistently without a cover crop, it leads to stratification of the soil. So you get these layers, and the water doesn't go in the same way. That's because no-till is supposed to have a cover crop applied to it, another grassy crop usually that then creates these pores. The problem here is the market. The market wants to purchase grains from South and North Dakota that are these 10,000 acre of exactly identical crops. And so then you've got your 2,000 acres of winter wheat coming out of Wisconsin. And what's the big grain company in Minneapolis? General Mills. They're just not interested in that, right? The scale that they're operating at is so gargantuan. And this has been a real problem in the agricultural sector over the last 5 to 10 years, that there's diversification occurring, but the market is a little bit weak, right? That we don't have the people willing to buy these things. And so there's work to be done yet. Then there's a lot of attitude shifts that are happening. Agriculture used to have this mindset of everything was about yield. How much are you producing, right? And the thing they would say is, we're feeding the world, right? That doesn't work very well when the farmers aren't being successful, right? When they're not succeeding in feeding themselves, right? And so there's a lot of shift happening where we're not talking about yield so much as profitability, right? And so they're thinking about the reducing their input costs, paying less money to farm while still maximizing the profit that they get out, right? And so we see activity like this, grass-fed beef, being a bigger and bigger thing that is being promoted, where we have cows that are feeding off of the grass. And this has a number of benefits. We have plants that are on the landscape all year long. Happy cows. There's also good evidence that the milk that comes from grass-fed has better fats in it. My parents are hippies, and there's something that I can't get away from of like, let's let the cows be cows. Cows eat grass, and when we feed cows grain and corn, that's something that they're not adapted to. You can only feed a cow, diet maxes out at like 20% corn before they get bloat. The starch concentration is not what their stomach is set up for, and it creates problems. And so this grass-fed beef really hits me in a lot of the places that aren't mathematical and logical, right? Where this is just a good idea for a lot of reasons. And so there's large programs coming on, like Grassland 2.0 is a big one in the area where they're trying to promote this and trying to figure out how to market this. And so over the last 10 years, Dunn County has had some of the highest applications of no-till agriculture in the state. And that's because all of the people that came together and shared these ideas with each other and changed the way that we are farming. Unfortunately, we're not done yet, right? There's more work to be done, which I guess is good for researchers. So we've got more work to do as well. And so there's all this. There's a lot of really good hope. There's a lot of really good directions for farmers to go. And also when this was work that my student this last summer, I guess our student, we worked with her together, Isabella, did. She was interested in this invasive aquatic plant, Potamogeton crispus, and it's a nasty invasive. It takes over lakes really, really effectively. And we were going out to examine this, and we thought that it was going to be everywhere, right? We had an assumption. And when we got out there and started actually analyzing the plants that we were pulling up, we were finding less of the P. crispus than we thought we were going to find. We had the native Potamogetons, the native pondweeds were there, and all kinds of other things as well. And so there still is a fair volume of the invasive Potamogeton crispus. But the other thing that we found in there was the Potamogeton perfoliatus, which is Wisconsin Natural Heritage Inventory aquatic plant. And so there's still a really great range of plant diversity out in Lake Monoman. We were, it's easy to look at it from the surface and think black, right? But then when we looked in and really analyzed it, there was so much more going on that was good in the lake. The other thing, we just got our hands on the 2019 DNR fish survey. We've been waiting for the DNR to do a fish survey of Lake Monoman, and there's a ton of walleye and bluegill and black crappie in the lake, and so there's a pretty healthy fishery in there as well. And so there's in Menominee there sort of is this attitude about, oh, the lake, it's such a problem, but yeah, there still is a lot of really good stuff going on out there, and I think that was really like when you were talking to the Hmong fishermen, and they were just like they were so excited about being able to go out on the ice and get all of these great fish. Also, there's new changes happening. The Painter Lake District went into effect. Are they pulling? Do we know if they're? Not sure when they'll begin to start pulling in money, and so. But this is can be a very positive thing where we can begin to maybe do some large scale management of Painter Lake. That will be one of the elements of that is its success will be determined by how much the community participates in it. Which is a lot of the sort of message I'd like to leave people with is that so much of this is about community participation, right? How we farm the land around here does a lot for how our water quality is. How those farmers act depends a lot on how the consumers in the area are. And so instead of buying your meat from the local mega store, finding a farmer and actually buying the meat from the farmer directly, right? Giving them the money and supporting not only the farmer but the infrastructure around it, right? I'm drawing a blank on what that guy's called, but the bandsaw, the butcher, right? Supporting the butcher as well, right? Because those infrastructures have shrunk as we've gone to Walmart, but they're still here. Right, there's still people here doing that work, and we can support them. We need to support them. It also is helping the city of Menominee. The city of Menominee is really intent on working to improve the lake, and they've done a lot of projects, putting in stormwater retention ponds and all of this stuff. But they tend to also dredge the lake a lot, which there's not a lot of evidence that dredging. It's a cart before the horse scenario, where the sediment is still flowing into the lake. So we need to stop the sediment and then dredge it. Whereas right now we're dredging it and we're kind of just creating a hole for more sediment to flow into. And so community engagement to engage with the city and come up with meaningful ways of creating a positive attitude towards the lake. So one of the interesting things of Menominee is we have sort of turned our back to the lake. We don't look at it. Our businesses face away from it. You think drive along this road right here and you'll see all of the businesses just facing away from the lake. Our dumpsters are facing towards the lake. And that's something that I think we need to stop doing. We need to engage with the lake in a positive way and start trying to figure out how to continue, sort of, it's not as bad as you think. I've swam in it every summer that we've worked on it. And the water is actually very clear, except for the ones that I can't say. What are those?
Yippee and Examiner?
Yeah. That word. I've been trying to say that for like a year and a half now, and it just does not come out of my mouth right. Yeah, which are definitely in there whenever I've been swimming. So, yeah.
Yeah, and so then one of the things we really wanted to mention is this is our kind of hopeful ending, right? The lake has beautiful things. There's lots of opportunities to get engaged and involved on the landscape. And then just to say, you know, this problem wasn't created in just a few years or even a few decades. And so it can be really hard to think really long term about these solutions. And so we're not going to solve this in a day or in a decade, but, you know, continual positive movement will hopefully start to be reflected in water quality very soon. And hopefully the great things about the lake will continue to get better as well. Forgot to tell you to put the slide in here, put everybody who helped me, ignored Arthur, but yeah, so I had a lot of help collecting data, and so I have a lot of people to thank, a lot of different funding sources, and thank you all for coming to hear us chat about the lake and the land. We also care about the land. Sorry.
Do you know why, I mean, the variation in the chlorophyll concentrations, why is there such a wide variation in none?
So I don't know, I've never done the stats to like look at predicting or explaining why it's high in the moment, but just thinking about other lakes and things that have found to be important in other lakes is, you know, what is your precipitation or what is your load in every given year? Like the amount of nutrients that comes in on an annual basis is really dependent on how much spring precipitation you get, whether you get sustained rain in the winter. So you can have huge swings just based on how your annual load changes. What's also really interesting about these systems is because it's a reservoir, water can flow through it really fast if you have big rainfall events. So if you have a massive rainfall in the middle of summer, you can flush out half the volume of the reservoir in a few days and just totally knock back that standing crop of phytoplankton. And so hydrology can play a really important role in it, as well as those nutrient inputs as well. And so one of the things I'm really excited about is how winter conditions, this is why I started sampling in the winter, is how winter conditions can kind of set us up for higher or lower nutrient concentrate or higher or lower phytoplankton in the summer by basically a lot of phytoplankton have resting stages that can land in the sediment and then come back out as soon as conditions get right. So if we have like a mild winter, do we have these resting stages coming out in April, in March, in April? And so we are just going into the summer with a whole bunch of things ready to take off. So I also think that's important. I don't have data. This is my hypothesis. So
Then the other one that I've heard, I think Bill James said that it's shallow, and so most lakes have a temperature overturn that happens like twice a year.
Sets up in the spring.
Yeah, and this lake supposedly can do that with just a high windy day. That will cause sediments to get stirred up. Boats, you know, I mean, it's not the area that is under 10 feet deep is fairly large, and so a boat prop going through that can stir it up.
But I would like to thank you. And so you mentioned groundwater. So February 29th, Dunn County, they're going to come and talk about all of the well testing they did over the summer. So they tested almost 1,000, I think it was like 950. And so they'll have those results so you can find out about that. And then February 22nd, we're going to go a lot larger. So we're going to look at systems and sustainability. And so how we can fix some of those systems. So keep an eye out. All right, thank you. Thank you. Thanks for coming.
Oh, thank you both.